The United States owes over $38 trillion, the largest national debt in human history. It is more than the combined economies of China, Japan, and Germany. On paper, it feels distant, numbers buried deep in Washington spreadsheets. But divide that debt across every American citizen. Each person owes more than $111,000. Every newborn, every retiree, every worker, already 6 figures in debt before earning a single dollar, and the pace of borrowing is accelerating. In 2000, the national debt was $5 trillion. By 2010, it had grown to $13 trillion. In 2020, $27 trillion. Today, $38 trillion and counting, nearly $1 trillion added every 100 days. This is not just numbers on a screen. It is a structural force shaping the US economy, and by extension, the global economy. To understand how we reached this point, we must go back. Back to the aftermath of World War II. In 1945, the US debt was 119% of GDP. High but understandable after financing a global war. Factories reopened, exports surged, tax revenues climbed. By 1974, debt had fallen to just 31% of GDP. Back then, debt was temporary, a wartime tool, not a permanent policy instrument. Everything changed in 1971. President Nixon ended the gold standard. The US dollar was no longer tied to gold. The nation could create money at will. Debt became limitless, and once limitless, it became addictive. The 1980s introduced deficits as policy. President Reagan cut taxes while increasing military spending. The national debt tripled in a single decade. Growth accelerated. Debt grew faster. The two went hand in hand. By the early 2000s, borrowing was normalized. Every administration, regardless of ideology, added to the debt. After the 9/11 attacks, the US entered 2 long wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, both largely financed through borrowing. At home, tax cuts continued even as spending increased. Debt had evolved from a temporary tool to a permanent engine. Then came 2008, the financial crisis. Wall Street collapsed. Major banks and auto manufacturers teetered on the edge of failure. The government intervened. Bailouts, quantitative easing, near-zero interest rates. Debt became the solution, not the problem. In less than a year, the United States added $2 trillion to its national debt. The precedent was set. Every crisis met with the same response: borrow, spend, stabilize. It worked. For a while. Markets recovered, stocks rebounded, jobs returned. But there was a hidden cost. The debt itself became permanent. Then came 2020. COVID-19. The federal government unleashed over $6 trillion in spending. Direct checks, unemployment benefits, business loans, vaccine programs, all financed through debt, all borrowed. The Federal Reserve printed money at an unprecedented pace. In 2020 alone, 40% of all US dollars in existence were created. The result was inevitable: inflation. From 2020 to 2022, prices rose at the fastest rate in 40 years. Mortgage rates doubled, energy costs soared, food prices climbed, yet the debt continued to rise. Psychological limits were crossed. Spending no longer required restraint. Interest on the debt is now the third largest federal expense after Social Security, after defense. In 2024, over $1 trillion were spent just paying interest. More than the entire military budget. Imagine a household relying on credit cards to pay interest on other credit cards. This is Washington today. It works only as long as lenders trust the United States. Confidence is finite. When it breaks, the consequences reach far beyond American borders. US debt also created power. Treasury bonds became the world's safest asset. Foreign governments, corporations, and banks relied on them to store wealth. This exorbitant privilege allowed America to print money the world actually wanted. But with privilege comes fragility. China holds $775 billion in US treasuries. Japan holds over $1 trillion. The European Union holds hundreds of billions more. If interest costs rise too high, or foreign investors lose confidence, bond prices fall. The dollar weakens. Markets panic. Global trade slows. The $38 trillion figure is not just an accounting problem. It is the foundation of the global financial system. Debt has become America's engine and its potential trigger for collapse. At the core lies a complex feedback loop: money, bonds, and trust. If any thread breaks, the system trembles. When the US Treasury needs cash, it issues bonds. These are promises. Pay me back with interest. Investors buy them. Banks, pension funds, foreign governments. The Treasury receives money to spend on defense, healthcare, infrastructure. Those bonds circulate globally, traded like currency themselves. They anchor the world economy. Central banks in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East hold US Treasuries as reserves. Corporations use them as collateral. Financial markets measure all risk relative to them. The Federal Reserve is the silent partner. When investors hesitate, the Fed steps in. It buys bonds with newly created money, keeping interest rates low. From 2008 to 2024, the Fed's balance sheet ballooned from under $1 trillion to over $8 trillion. Each rescue builds stability, but also dependency. Roughly one-third of US government debt is held by foreign creditors. The largest are Japan and China. The United Kingdom, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia also hold significant portions. Why lend? Because US Treasuries are safe, liquid, and backed by the world's reserve currency. They serve as global savings accounts, earning modest interest while ensuring security. But this relationship relies entirely on trust. If confidence falters, investors can stop buying or start selling, yields spike, the dollar weakens, borrowing costs explode. Debt is not merely financial, it is geopolitical. Who holds it? Controls leverage. At its heart, the debt machine runs on invisible fuel: trust. Trust in growth, in the government, and in the dollar's stability. History shows trust is fragile. Once lost, it never fully returns. Rising interest rates are now the silent threat. For decades, the United States borrowed at near zero cost. Every crisis, from the dot-com crash to the 2008 recession to the pandemic, was met with cheaper money. Debt grew, markets stabilized, and the illusion of endless resilience persisted. But the era of zero-cost borrowing is over. Inflation returned. The Federal Reserve raised rates. Suddenly, the cost of servicing debt escalated. 1 percentage point increase adds hundreds of billions annually. 2 points, trillions. Even minor shifts can destabilize global markets. The bond market is sensitive. Yields spike, prices drop. Banks feel the strain, pension funds wobble, emerging economies tremble. This is the interest trap. A system built on cheap money now confronts reality. Debt was once a tool to stimulate growth. Now it is a potential trigger for collapse. The human impact is immediate. Mortgage payments rise, student loans become heavier, daily essentials, food, energy, healthcare, grow more expensive. Retirees watch savings erode. Workers face slower wage growth. It is not abstract. Debt shapes everyday life. It shapes choices. It shapes futures. The global implications are profound. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. US debt is the collateral supporting global trade. Oil, commodities, even digital currencies rely on it. China experiments with settling trade in yuan. Russia bypasses the dollar for energy exports. The Middle East explores alternative payment systems. Each shift erodes global demand for dollars. Fewer buyers for bonds, higher rates at home. A fragile system begins to strain. Historical parallels are striking. Rome overextended its legions. Britain relied on borrowed wars and naval supremacy. The Soviet Union financed oil and social programs with massive debt. Every empire eventually confronted limits. Overextension, reliance on borrowed stability, and fragile confidence. A repeating pattern. Debt fuels growth but also sows vulnerability. The greater the borrowing, the higher the risk. The US debt machine is unlike any before. Its size, scale, and global integration are unprecedented, yet the fundamental risks remain familiar. Confidence is the linchpin. If trust in the dollar falters, the effects are global. Bond prices collapse, markets panic, currencies fluctuate, oil spikes, trade slows, emerging economies struggle. Even small shocks can cascade. A single foreign investor selling US Treasuries can trigger chain reactions worldwide. This is the silent countdown ticking beneath the surface. The Federal Reserve plays a balancing act. It intervenes, buys bonds, stabilizes markets. But each rescue also increases dependence. The system spins faster, teetering on momentum. Who truly holds the power? Foreign governments, banks, and corporations. Their decisions can stabilize or destabilize the United States. Debt is both shield and sword. It gives the US unparalleled influence. Treasury bonds anchor global finance. But that influence is fragile. Imagine a single misstep. Interest rates rise sharply. Confidence wavers. A chain reaction unfolds. The very foundation of global markets shakes. The US has options, but the path is narrow. Reform requires raising taxes, cutting spending, restructuring entitlements. Every choice carries political and social costs. Delay is dangerous. Every empire in history that postponed these decisions faced decline. Rome, Britain, the Soviet Union, all delayed action. Collapse followed hesitation. Human consequences are real. Families adjust budgets. Businesses postpone investment. Jobs vanish. Savings diminish. Inflation, interest costs, and taxes interact like a perfect storm. The average American experiences the effect daily. From Wall Street to Main Street, the stakes are intertwined. Markets, governments, and citizens form a fragile web, each thread dependent on confidence, trust, and perception. The dollar's dominance creates a double-edged sword. It allows borrowing at low rates. It underpins global trade. It fuels economic growth. But any erosion of trust multiplies risk. New financial systems emerge. Trade shifts away from the dollar. Interest rates spike. Debt spirals out of control. Every empire eventually reaches its limits. Rome devalued the denarius. Britain's global borrowing reached unsustainable peaks. The Soviet Union collapsed under economic and political strain. The US is not immune. It has power, influence, and resources. But it shares the same underlying vulnerabilities. Confidence remains the linchpin. Trust is invisible, but its collapse is tangible. History teaches that once lost, trust rarely returns fully. This is the story of leverage. Debt as power, debt as poison. Debt as the silent countdown to global consequences. The $38 trillion debt is more than a number. It is a countdown. A silent force shaping every decision, every market, every life. Empires before us faced limits. Rome, Britain, the Soviet Union. All grew powerful, all borrowed heavily, all faced the consequences of overreach. The United States is different in scale, but not in principle. Confidence is the linchpin. Trust is invisible, but without it the system collapses. Every citizen, every investor, every government watches this fragile web. One misstep, one loss of trust, can ripple across the globe. Yet there is hope. History also shows recovery is possible. Discipline, reform, prudent policy, and strategic global cooperation can stabilize even the largest systems. The choice is ours to make. To delay is to risk history repeating itself. To act is to navigate uncertainty with courage and clarity. As you consider these numbers, these figures, these risks, ask yourself, what kind of world do we want to inherit? What kind of decisions will define our future? The $38 trillion problem is not distant. It is here, it is now. And the consequences, global, economic, human, are unfolding silently beneath the surface. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us explore history, finance, and the patterns shaping our world.